Okay, morning everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is our fifth show and tell now of the beta phase, and we're now halfway through. As with previous sessions, there is a link to the Q&A on Slido, which went around with the invitation as well. Please drop any questions in there, and we'll answer them at the end. So what have we? Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Just to recap, so what are we doing? So we've been funded by MHCLG to work with partners and stakeholders to try and develop an alternative offering to planning officers and local authorities for processing planning applications. On the next slide is our roadmap. So as I say, we're just over halfway now, halfway through. We're still very much focusing on permitted development, but we've now started incorporating the functionality required for full applications as well, which you'll see as we go through. So what have we been up to since we last spoke? So we've continued iterating the prototype and then developing that. And continue testing. It's all about testing. So we've spoken with 6 officers and managers from 5 councils in the last couple of weeks. We've been laying the foundations for document management. So we've been asking questions about referencing of documents and applications, which is not straightforward. Neither is data protection, but those are things we're working through. We now have proof of concepts for APIs both at the front end and at the back end, and we can pull applications through and the information through together with the GDPO or the relevant sections of the GDPO that we can show to officers as they're going through an application. And then at the other end, we've got a proof of concept for Melissa and Anastasia have been working on a version of the planning register, just so you can visualize and see the outcomes and the output of a planning application. And obviously we've been continuing to speak with the RIPA project as well to make sure that we are fully aligned, so we can release an end-to-end system. I will hand over now, and Claudia will take you through the design.
Good morning, everyone. So for design and research, we've been busy doing more iterations. So what we have been doing using the GovUK prototype kit is making sure that planning managers can ask for corrections from their officers if they don't agree with what the officer has said. For planning officers, we've also worked on replacing documents, reviewing corrections, and now we can populate the decision notice automatically. So I'll show you that in more detail. And in the sprint, we were also doing some testing with planning officers and managers, and we spoke to people from 5 different councils this sprint. Next slide, please. So some of the changes were mainly on this page that the officer saw. So I showed this in the last show and tell, as we had adapted our prototype based on the applicant's data that we would receive from RIPA. Upon testing, we had a lot of mixed feedback. They could see where we were going with this, but it was a big change to their process. And the way that it was formatted wasn't helping people immediately. It was taking them a while to go through all the questions and process it because the order didn't really seem logical to them. Some of it is also that this is quite different language than they're used to. They're used to looking at policy language, whereas this is more for applicants. So it's kind of like getting them to reframe slightly. But based on how they were working through it, I changed the prototype to see how this would test, if it would test better. And I pulled out the questions that were linked to GDPR policies and then displayed that with the policy name underneath. And this kind of helps prioritize which questions will really help the officer. But there's still a show all responses underneath the 8 questions that are more relevant and this would show all 18 questions that the applicant answered. So far testing is going well with this, but we're figuring out if it will make it to the MVP or not, because they can still do their job with the previously developed screen. Can you go to the next slide, please? And on the same page, if you were to scroll down underneath the questions, that's when the officer would be asked, have permitted development requirements been met? Yes or no? And then we had a comment box for each, which would populate the decision notice. But when we were doing testing, we had a lot of mixed feedback of what people would put in that box. And it seems like it could be a lot of room for error, or it couldn't be used correctly. And we did get comments from multiple people about how this should really be automated. And because they use standardized paragraphs anyway, but they'd have to find them and fill in from that template. So this time I iterated it based on the GDPO that we added above. So what if we pulled the same policies that have been shown above into this checkbox, and that's what goes on the decision notice. And separately, if they have any comments just for their manager to see, they could write it there, but it wouldn't populate the decision notice. And I did this because we heard that the managers want to know what certain measurements are, but that's not, and that allows the managers to know what has and hasn't been checked, but it doesn't necessarily need to go on the decision notice. So for now, we're doing that comment box is just for the manager, but we're having mixed opinions about that with testing. So we'll see how it goes as well. Next slide, please. And I think, yeah, I'm handing over to Michelle.
So as part of this sprint, we've had some really interesting discussions where we've dug a bit more into the detail about specific parts of kind of what a back office system needs to provide. One of those things is a reference number. So every application, planning application, has a unique reference number. So you can see it there just on the screen. That's kind of the format it appears with applications in Southwark. However, there isn't a standard format. It seems to vary from council to council. And the variation appears to be because it depends on what back office system that council uses. We've also spoken to kind of officers and managers as part of our broader research, and nobody really knows kind of, you know, what this kind of reference is for, why it's in the format it is, or doesn't necessarily even care about it. It's just something the system creates. So we've started to think, okay, well, what kind of reference number does BoPS need to generate? We know it needs to be unique. We did consider adding in UPRNs, unique property reference numbers, but we decided against this for now, just because it wouldn't necessarily be unique in that one property could have several planning applications attached to it over the years. And so we're going to start simple. We're just going to start with an 8-digit reference number, starting at 1 and counting up, regardless of what kind of application it is, and also regardless of which council. So this will work for multiple users for now. We may kind of add to this later on. For example, add more identifiers to that reference, such as something that identifies the planning authority. So in Southwark's case, that might include the letters SWK. However, for now, because there isn't a standard, we don't want to spend too long kind of trying to get this right without really understanding the need for it. So we'll just start with that simple reference. And this is something that we will be implementing in the next sprint. Next slide, please. So something else that we're really keen to understand is drawing numbers. So we know at the moment on decision notices, this is kind of what goes to the applicant to tell them the decision. It kind of lists what the decision is based on. And one of those things is, okay, you can go ahead, this has been granted based on this set of drawings that you have supplied, and it lists the specific drawing number. We can guess and make an assumption that this is useful for enforcement, and I'll come to that in a moment, but we can't actually find this written down in any policy. It's not, as far as we can tell, that it definitely has to be on there. So we think it might be kind of useful from a legal standpoint. But we definitely kind of want more research about this. So if we can just go to the next slide. So this is what I mean by an enforcement point of view. So you've kind of been granted planning permission, and it's based on the drawing on the left, and then you build what's on the right, and the planning authority, so they didn't agree to that kind of shark on the roof. So this is where enforcement would come in, and they would be able to prove with the decision notice that it was granted based on the previous drawings. And this is what we think that's for. But again, before we look at how we can do it, we want to just kind of clarify what the need is and if there's a different way of doing that. If we go to the next slide. And one of the issues is actually we don't know where we can pull drawing numbers from. So they appear on the bottom corner of the drawings, which is submitted as PDFs. It could be one PDF, it could be several, but these won't necessarily be kind of uploaded by the applicant. They'll upload the drawings, but they won't actually manually type out that drawing number. So we need to consider, do we want to put that burden on our users where they have to type that in, or is there another way we can do it? And what could we do for MVP, and what can we then kind of perhaps iterate and make a bit easier later on? One of the added complications is that, like a lot of this, there's not any kind of standard for a drawing number. It varies from different architect practices. That's not necessarily a problem, but it does make it harder, for example, maybe to quickly scan or do something clever around that, looking for those drawing numbers. And one of the complications as well is that sometimes you will get somebody submitting a drawing, like the one on the left here, where it shows kind of one thing. So here is kind of the section, and it has one drawing number. But then on the right is another example where you have a PDF with just one page in it, but it has actually 3 different drawings showing the first floor plan, the attic plan, and the roof plan, but it only has one drawing number. So this is kind of why we want to investigate a bit further, kind of, is this definitely needed on decision notices? And if it is, how can we kind of get that out of there and make sure we can then display it on those decision notices? If we go to the next slide. Thanks. And then just about conditions, really. So we know that this is going to be something that we really kind of want to look into, do a bit more research and testing, particularly when we look at full applications. Full planning permission. At the moment, we're still building permitted development. However, in our research and testing of that, some officers have still kind of raised kind of how conditions fit in, particularly, I think the example given was, will it say on the decision notice that this has been, that you can have a certificate of lawfulness based on Class A conditions being met? We know that with full applications, those conditions tend to be kind of spelled out a bit more. So if you can see on the in the picture, we've got a screenshot of a letter from Southwark, a decision notice, and it actually spells out what those conditions are. One of the most common ones is that materials need to be specified. So again, we want to understand, okay, where can we get these conditions from? Can we make it easy for officers to apply conditions without having to manually type them in and copy and paste them each time? Can they be codified? So you've got this kind of application, and these are the kinds of conditions that could be added to it. And we want to understand again, like, what are they for? We believe they're useful for enforcement, so we're really keen to speak to enforcement officers to get their thoughts as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, we really need your help. We've got a lot of ideas about this, but also quite a few assumptions. We want to learn more about conditions, more about enforcement and what is needed. And as always, we will continue to kind of test our prototypes with managers and officers. If you want to be involved in testing, or even just a very formal conversation about any of those things that I've just shared, please get in touch. My email is on the screen. And now I am going to hand over to Neil, I believe, for the next screen.
Hi there. I'm just going to talk through a couple of slides which communicate some other work and sort of maybe some background discussions, in a sense, that we've been doing this sprint. Earlier in this show and tell, you've seen designs for document management. And this slide really just puts across our discussion around that, which is on the right hand side, you can see kind of two examples of how documents may be submitted by an applicant. On the top there, you see that represents a single document containing multiple drawings for their property. And at the bottom, you can see one document per drawing. The coloured labels, they just indicate the tag system that we're planning to use. We decided to use this because we're not sure essentially how applicants will upload their documents, and we're in discussions with Open Systems Lab and their Plan X product about how we might be able to manage that on the front end. And I think I think it's fair to say we're thinking along similar lines. So while we find out more essentially and test with users, we want to keep things as flexible as possible. And on that similar point of being flexible, for the moment, we're not going to prioritize versioning of documents because we realize this sprint that the more we allow the ability for an officer to sort of go back into the past and change existing tags on documents or replace old documents, the more complex it would become. So instead, we're going to stick with two broad features. One is to upload a new document and with tags from a predefined set, and the other feature will be to archive an existing document. And with those two features, we hope that officers will have kind of everything they need to progress the application essentially, and to make sure that the right references are included on the decision notice. So obviously documents that end up being archived wouldn't be present on that notice. On kind of a different point, but also one of the sort of background discussions we've had this sprint, we're planning to deliver the product to a small number of councils after beta, and we had a discussion about the best way to kind of move forward with that. Essentially, so far in the system and the demos that you may have seen before, we haven't got a concept of a council within the system, within the back end. But what we've kind of laid kind of a roadmap in a sense of what we're going to do is we're going to stick with a single system and make it multi-tenanted. So each council would have their own workspace in a sense, and they would be able to work within their own set of users and their own set of applications, of course, but not obviously see other councils' information. One of the advantages of having that sort of centralized system, that one installation, rather than the other extreme, which would be an installation per council. One of the advantages of keeping it central, in a sense, is that we can roll out features and upgrades much easier, especially as we're in the beta phase. So our plan ahead, really, we're going to work together as a team, as usual, and identify every part of the system that we expect to vary between councils. On the right-hand side, you see the decision notice, and I've just highlighted in red some of the more obvious things that we're expecting to change between councils, the name of the council, of course, and you know, the head of planning for that council as well, that person's name, along with various other parts of the system. So we're going to do a kind of a sweep through the service and identify all of those parts. Then we're going to write and deliver a story which will sort of turn on councils in a sense, and it will allow us, the way that that would be tested is, as you can probably imagine, to walk through the journey of assessment and reviewing for each different council that we have. And then just kind of looking a little further down the line, rather than going for the full rich version of management of councils, which would involve some kind of super admin user having a form to fill in all of this data that you might see on the right hand side. Rather than offering that feature for now, the task of actually inputting all of that council specific data would remain a developer task. So now I'm going to switch over to the demo of the service itself. So in previous demos, I think every time we've stepped through the core workflow, if you weren't in those previous demos, you can look at our previous recordings. This time I'm not going to go through that full workflow, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of other features instead. So I'm logging in here as the manager, and I'm going to first of all talk about the document management that we've delivered this sprint. So the core of it really is this section of the accordion, which kind of is visible throughout the journey for an officer and a manager. So what we're seeing here really is these are thumbnails that are dynamically generated based on files that were uploaded to the system. So that's different from what we showed before. Before we were kind of maybe cheating a bit because we just linked directly to images here. What you're seeing here is actually something different. In the background, we've uploaded documents into cloud storage, and we're actually doing dynamic processing of these images to represent them as thumbnails. And this is a really flexible solution that will work with any number of images as we progress with the upload and archiving stories. I'm just going to highlight the fact that you can, as you'd expect, view the full version of the image. This one is a PNG. This one is a PDF. But we handle them both the same, and we present them both the same on the front end. So as I say, we've got the back-end infrastructure to support that now. Just to point out this section as well. So this is where you'll, this will be the starting point for the other document management stories that I mentioned, including upload, and archiving of documents. So this will be the main section where you do those activities. So that's what I wanted to say on that side. And the other thing I wanted to touch on here is that we've delivered a story which will allow other services to consume the output of our service. So what I mean by that is that a service such as the planning register could use our data. So what we've done is best really to show you the data. So we've made an API essentially, and what you're seeing here is some of the details don't matter that much, but you're seeing essentially a list of representations of planning applications that have been determined by the manager. And you can pick out different details here, the address, the status of it, and so on. So here's 3. So that represents all, for the moment, all determined applications in the system. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to act as the manager and determine another planning application, and we'll see this list. I expect to see this list get populated with another application. Then I'm going to hand over to Evangelos, and he's going to show you how we can bring this data to life. So just a bit of background if you haven't seen before. I'm a manager and I'm reviewing the work that the office has done previously on this particular application. My final step is to review the outcome decision notice. And in terms of my to-do list, I see that I've kind of done all my work for right now, and I've progressed everything to determined. Switching back to the API, we see that extra application has been populated in the data, ready to be used by another service. So I'm going to hand over now, as I mentioned.
Hello, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen, and here you will see a React application that Melissa and Anastasia built using the API endpoint, which is fetch the planning application decision. As I mentioned, this is a React application that uses GovUK component, and here you can see that the application number, the site address, the application type, the summary of proposal, receive date, decided date, and the decision of this particular planning application. This was a POC to make sure to show that you can use our endpoint and you can create an application to illustrate the data. Going back to our slide, I will hand over to Jack, who will talk about the next step.
Yeah, thanks, Evangelos. So next steps for the next fortnight, we'll continue to develop out this MVP document management feature. We will also look to integrate Notify. Now, obviously, when decision notices are created, we need to be able to notify the original applicant, but also in previous stages we need to notify consultees, so neighbours, statutory consultees, etc. And gov.uk notify allows you to do this. It's a much better way of doing it than it's currently done. We'll continue developing the manager review and amendments journey. So what happens when a manager doesn't agree with a recommendation or has comments that they want to amend the recommendation. As Michelle was talking about earlier on, so conditions. We've started having conversations with a few enforcement officers, but we'll continue working on that. And then, yeah, further iterations of content and styling following testing and feedback. I just wanted to point out, Southwark can't claim credit for the shark. I think that was Oxford. We also will be having our first session with an economist from Catapult, who's going to help us with our business case. And what's good about that is that they have Green Book experience, so that should help us put together a pretty strong case. I think that's it for presentation. Are there any questions that have come through?
Yeah, a mixture of kind of questions and comments.
Cool, go for it.
Okay, so first one was from Peter Forrest, who's saying it's maybe time for a working group to look at a national reference numbering system for BoPS and RIPA. And that's got 2 upvotes, so that's a self-selected group of 3 people to start that working group. Thank you all for volunteering. Then got another one from Sunny Siderman, who's saying one solution for references for drawings is the system generates its own reference for each drawing in the same way a reference is generated for applications. I think that's something to look at. And kind of following on from that, Paul Downey was saying that if the drawing is evidence for legal purposes, then maybe a hash or a fingerprint on the document could be used as a reference and proof that it hasn't been tampered with. Then to do a few more. One from Anonymous, who's saying the procedure order provides a detail of what needs to be included in the decision by referencing the details. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I think we need to dig into that a bit more. I don't fully understand it. Not know if that means anything to you, Jack.
Yeah, so we've had a good look through the Dumpo over the last couple of days, and it doesn't strictly help with drawing reference numbers. It's I think, as Paul pointed out, it's more legal help, really. So when it comes to appeals and enforcement, that's when it's a reference number for each specific drawing. So everyone can see what's been approved. So no sneaky helipad or shark or extra dwelling has been slip through. But yeah, I mean, as I say, we'll continue looking into this over the next couple of weeks.
Cool. And then Paul was also asking whether the policy reference numbers cited in the decision notices are something that can be hyperlinked to.
Can I just add a comment about this? So this was actually something that was also mentioned in a user testing session yesterday, so more on the side where the officer is looking at something, and it would be helpful potentially for graduate planners because they don't necessarily know those references off by heart yet. We know it would be useful. The thing would be thinking about where to actually link them to and how reliable that link is likely to be. I think it's something we definitely need to look into a bit more, and then it might be something we also consider. We're not actually creating a planning register as part of this, so we just created that proof of concept to demonstrate, to illustrate how the API works, but we're not, it's kind of not part of this project to create a planning register. But on there, for example, you could have a decision notice that is a web page, and that could list the policies in more kind of human readable language as well. But I think we just have to figure out where we would pull that data from or where we would link to. But it's definitely a good point because it's something we've heard.
Cool. I guess with linking to policy as well, it's probably be for bit development. I think that would be more straightforward in that it's national policy, but maybe when you're getting into like full house applications, it's variable. It might get a bit onerous. So I probably need to think a bit more about how we can do that elegantly. Sorry, Mike, were you going to say something? Right, okay, cool. Then the final two, another one from Paul saying the API looks really good. Can we add the UPRNs? So yes. And then final one from Kevin Buckthorpe is the API looks excellent. Are there any thoughts for reporting options within the software in future, such as how many applications have been received?
It is something that we might want to include later on. It's just it's not something that's kind of come up in our research and testing at the moment. We're aware this would be useful, but with our immediate users, it's been very much focused on kind of understanding what they need to complete an assessment. We know, like at a higher level and perhaps at a central government level, it would be potentially really useful to pull that stuff out, and that might also be something that could potentially tie into a national planning register, for example. That might be one way where you could show on there some kind of way to filter and see kind of applications at a national level and statistics around that. So I think it is a really interesting kind of thing to consider and to look into. I'm just not sure if it's necessarily going to be part of this MVP, but I think it would be valuable for people.
I guess the other thing to consider as well is like the way that we're working on BoPS currently is we're kind of looking a lot at like the core process of like managing an application, where with the intention that kind of other things like kind of doing detailed markup of PDFs would be handled by another application. Probably like consultation would be done in another application. We're trying to kind of get that middle bit that all the other things hang off. So I guess the question there about whether reporting should be done within BoPS or whether people should use kind of like a corporate BI tool or something, whether that's more appropriate or maybe a mix of the two. So TBC, I think. Right. Yeah, that's everything from questions and comments so far.
Oh, actually, I think I've refreshed and I've got another one from.
Oh, right.
It's a comment, I think, and they've said we include plan references as a condition, which can then subsequently be varied if need be.
Cool.
That's kind of how we thought they could be potentially used, but again, I guess we just need to find out a bit more. That person is anonymous, because otherwise I would suggest whether they would like to have a chat about it. If you would like to, my email was on one of the previous slides, because we definitely like to discuss this and find out a bit more. There it is. Thanks.
If that's all of the questions, I think thank you very much everyone for presenting and for watching. See you in 2 weeks.